Well, good evening. Good to see you tonight. Thanks for coming out. And this is an exciting night for us because we're pioneering a partnership that we have with City Care Counseling Center. And this is the first talk on relationships, and we've got 3 talks lined up. And we really have decided to do this to bring mental health to our church and community. And we believe these subjects on relationships are going to be very helpful to whether you're a parent, or whether you're in a marriage, or whether at work. There's just a lot of good things that you're going to learn, and I'm excited about tonight. Let me introduce our speaker. By the way, I should say I'm Bryce McFadden, and one of the pastors here at Journey. But our speaker tonight, his name is Joe Slaybaugh, and let me share a little bit about Joe. He's a licensed mental health practitioner. He's also a licensed minister, and he has served the Omaha community for the last 18 years, both as a minister and a counselor. He received his bachelor's degree in theology and his master's in clinical counseling. So he comes to us tonight, well-educated, well-qualified. I'm just setting expectations, Joe, really high for you. There's a high bar tonight. But no, currently he's at City Care Counseling Center in the Old Mill location, it's called. So he's operating out of there. Now, I didn't want to just leave it with all your credentials. It's impressive. It's good. But let me share a little piece of trivia about Joe, that we know he's a professional, but he's also a pretty real human being. He shared this with me. He was fired from a lawn care company on the first day for weed whacking rose bushes in the customers' mulch beds. Now, Joe, thanks for being vulnerable, raising an old wound. Trust there's been some healing on that. I was thinking of this, though. We're probably not going to hire you for yard work, but we're looking forward to some relational work that you're going to share with us tonight. So your topic tonight, why conversations stall and how to get them back on track. And I'd encourage you, if you got pen and paper, I think you're going to hear some things tonight and some little tips and whatnot. I think you're going to want to take some notes and begin to use some of this stuff in your relationships. So I encourage you to take notes. And we are going to have a Q&A time after Joe has finished with his topic tonight. But why don't we welcome Joe up here to chat with us tonight. All right.
Thank you, Bryce. I appreciate you, brother. It's always really wonderful to get introduced to an audience with one of your most embarrassing moments in life. So I really appreciate that. To give some context of the story, since Bryce brought it up, 19 years old, sophomore year, summer, and it was a friend of mine who still owns a lawn care business. He called me up on a Thursday night, and he said, hey, I'm short-handed tomorrow. Do you want to meet up, and we'll go around, and you handle the trimmer, and we'll take care of the mowing. Pay you, I think he said like $300, which for me at 19 sounded amazing. So, and then he told me we're going to meet up at 6 a.m. I was like, that doesn't sound like any fun at all. But I tried it, I did it, and I was horrible the whole day. So it wasn't just the rose bushes, it was the entire thing. We get to the end of the day, and I said, well, should I plan on meeting you guys Monday morning? He says, you know what? You can sleep in. Really, really appreciate my friend there. Really, really appreciate that. I learned something, and it reinforced something that I think I already knew at that time in my life. If I was going to make any type of a living, I was going to have to do it by having conversations rather than working with my hands. That put a lot of pressure on me to figure out how to have good conversations, because conversations are hard. Conversations can be awkward. Look at a neighbor right now and say, conversations can be awkward. Yeah, you understand. Now look at another neighbor and explain why you didn't turn to them the first time. Oh, and now you understand conversations can be awkward just a little bit. We're going to talk about conversations tonight. Why do they break down from time to time? Why do they stall? How do we get them back on track? That's going to be our goal this evening. And as we dive into that, I wanted to share with you guys some figures, some studies that have been done when it comes to communication trends in the recent past. So let's take a look at a few of these things. One thing that we notice is communication habits are a primary predictor of how successful a relationship will be. Now, that's actually been researched. We might say that's common sense, but we are finding it's a primary predictor based on how well you communicate in your relationship to how successful that relationship will be. Less negative communication in relationships was consistently linked to higher individual satisfaction in another study. And I think that's very important to note because it's not just about the relationship, it's about the individual in those conversations feeling better about themselves, better about the other person, and better about the relationship. That's really interesting. There was a European study done recently, and they found intergenerational communication is becoming more distant in mutual understanding despite increasing interactions due to digital resources. So what are we learning here? We're learning that conversations are immensely important. Communication is a primary predictor of how successful a relationship is going to be. And yet, it seems like across the generations and even within generations, we're finding ourselves more distant from each other in mutual understanding despite having more resources to communicate today than any other time in human history. And that's really, really interesting to me. It makes me wonder, why would conversations stall? Why are we struggling with conversations that might break down or relationships that distance themselves from one another because it's too hard to even talk anymore? Why is that happening when we have more resources than ever, allowing us to have more communication than ever before? I don't know if we would never have time to get to every single reason why conversations might break down. That would take maybe an entire lifetime of study. But I do want to note 3 primary reasons why we're finding conversations break down. And I'd like to share those with you guys as we get started tonight. Reason number 1 is a negative cycle that we're finding of avoidance. This comes from Dr. David Olson with Prepare Enrich. Prepare Enrich is a large couples counseling program that now has 100,000 facilitators across the world, and they reach millions of couples and relationships every single year. What they're finding in their research is that there seems to be this cycle in conversations of avoidance. What does that look like? Well, when we are in relationship with someone, we have a tendency to silence ourselves, to not say what we really want to say in those pivotal conversations with the person or the persons that we care about. And when we avoid those topics or we silence ourselves, we keep quiet when we know we want to say something, we tend to feel dominated by the other person or persons in the group or in the relationship. And that cycle of avoidance to feeling dominated, you know what that creates? It creates resentment and some bitterness, specifically towards the person that you feel dominated by. And we're noticing that this is really inhibiting a lot of conversations, a lot of relationships that we see in this country as well as abroad. So we want to note that there's this negative cycle of avoidance that seems to be a primary reason why conversations tend to break down. Similar to a negative cycle of avoidance, we see a negative cycle of conflict. And that comes from John Gottman and the Gottman Institute, which is probably the largest, most renowned couples counseling research center and therapy equipping program in the world right now. And what Gottman is finding is that there seems to be this negative cycle in conversations of criticism to defensiveness. Now, that seems pretty obvious, pretty common sense, but it's really fascinating when you think about that, because if you are constantly criticized with someone or multiple people that you're in relationship with, your natural tendency is probably going to become defensive in almost every interaction. And unfortunately, then that perpetuates more criticism, either on your part or on their part, which is going to continue to perpetuate more defensiveness. And we get in this relationship spiral. Yikes, we don't want to be in that relationship spiral where we're just criticizing each other, we're defending ourselves over trying to work a problem, resolve a conflict. It's just more criticism, more defensiveness, and we find ourselves spiraling down and down and down and down. This seems to be a predominant reason why conversations tend to break down. And the last one I want to bring up to you guys when it comes to conversations or reasons why conversations break down, well, I call this the blame game. And the blame game happens before the conversation even starts. The blame game is all about presuppositions. It's all about thoughts in our head, presumptions that we have going in to whatever conversation we know we need to conduct with whoever we're talking to. See, the blame game focuses on a problem as it's the other person's fault. So we presuppose, before even starting the conversation, the only way that there's going to be a resolution is if the other person or people fix the problem. And that creates a focus of blame rather than a focus of resolution. John Gordon, who's a pretty well-known researcher and author, he's made probably most famous for his book, The Energy Bus. John Gordon says, positive people attack problems, not people. And I'll be honest, in my time in ministry, in my time in clinical counseling, what I see most, especially in what I'm doing right now, because most of my practice focuses on relationship conflict right now, what I see most often is people coming into my office and they have incredible bitterness towards someone that's hurt them, and they're holding on, maybe it's hope, maybe it's control, I'm not entirely sure, but they're holding on to the idea that if they can just learn enough to fix the other person, then everything's going to be okay again. I think if we're honest with ourselves, and I'm talking to me just as much as you, but if we're honest with ourselves, we tend to blame other people for the problems in our lives, whether or not they caused it, because that can be legitimate. They may have caused the problem, but it's still a problem that we need help fixing. So I love the idea that Gordon postulates, which is positive people attack the problem, not people around them. And if you see behind me, I really like this thought in the person's head on the second side. We have a problem, and I need your help. If you're in relationship with anyone and there's a problem between you, I don't know if you've thought about it this way, but there's probably only one person in the world or one group of people in the world that can help you fix that problem. And that's the person or persons who are involved with the problem. So instead of blaming them for its existence, it seems to be much more positive to focus on working with them to fix the problem. And yet the blame game seems to be a primary reason why conversations really, really struggle, why they break down, why we have a hard time getting through them. So these are three primary reasons why we're finding conversations fail, why conversations break down, why they stall. We look at some negative cycles of avoidance, conflict, and we have this presupposed idea in our heads called the blame game, where we automatically just assume it's the other person's fault and they need to fix the problem whenever we have that conversation about it. Let's talk instead about how we can fix these problems, how we can get these conversations back on track. And there's really one big goal that I want to communicate to you guys tonight, and that's really all I'm here to do, and then I'm going to talk some more because that's what we do as therapists and pastors. But we're going to try to communicate this one big goal for the evening, and that's become more responsive and less reactive in our conversations. You can say it again, become more responsive and less reactive in our conversations. So reactiveness is going to look like it'll primarily be influenced by emotions while reacting to a situation. That's typically what we're talking about when we say reactive behavior. On the other side, becoming more responsive is influenced by a logical process of assessing emotions, thoughts, and desires before reacting to said situation. Do we have any parents, maybe some teenagers or some grown kids, or maybe we've got some toddlers at home? Yeah, we see some hands there. If you've ever had a conversation with, let's say, a teenager or maybe a 10-year-old, something like that, and they've just done something that you never thought was even humanly possible to come up with the idea. And you say to them what every single parent says, which is, "What were you thinking?" And that kid who you love immensely looks back at you with the biggest, dumbest face in the world, and they say, "I don't know. Got no idea." Well, the truth is they probably weren't thinking. They were probably just reacting. I spent some time working at Boys Town. I had the opportunity to work there for a few years as a crisis counselor, and one of the things that they teach at Boys Town is this interesting phrase on their campus. It's called rationale in absentia, which is a fancy way of saying sometimes we do not think, we only react. And when we only react, we really roll the dice on what's going to happen next. The consequences can become very, very risky. So what are we trying to do in our conversations? We want to become more responsive. We want to put more filters in place to process through those emotional reactions. We want to think through, hey, what are my desires in this, but also what are my desires more long term? How do I want to see this person next week? Do I want to interact with this person next month? What can I do to resolve the situation over the long term? We want to put some logic into place. We want to work with emotions for sure, but the big thing we want to try to do is become more responsive and less reactive. So if there's one thing you could take away from tonight as you're having your conversations with coworkers, family members, friends, it would be in those conversations, very quietly in your own mind, am I responding right now or am I reacting? And I think that's a very profound question, but it can be very hard to answer sometimes. Am I responding to this moment, or am I just reacting to the moment? Is my rationale absent right now, and I'm acting purely on emotions and thoughts? So this is going to be our big goal in conversations, to get us back on track. What we're going to try to do with this big goal, we're going to try to introduce a model that may help you get those conversations back on track. And we're calling this the Conversation Highway Model with you guys. You can take a look at the back here. So we have this Conversation Highway Model. We're getting on the on-ramp this way. We're merging into the highway. We're working our way across, and we're finding an off-ramp eventually, leading on to hopefully better relationships, better conversations down the road. But what we're finding is that a conversation highway model really helps us become more responsive in our conversations. What are we trying to do? We're trying to focus and emphasize responsiveness, and we're trying to reduce the amount of reactivity in our conversations that we're having. Not every conversation is going to require this type of a model. What we are looking for specifically is what's called an activating situation that would need to have a conversation about. An activating situation is something that activates some sort of negative emotion, some sort of negative response, some sort of reactivity. I'd imagine when most of you put on your shoes today, it wasn't very activating. So that's not the type of conversation we need to have this type of model with. What we want to try to do is we want to try to find those activating conversations, and they can be anything and everything. First 2 years of my marriage, an activating conversation was how to fold laundry. I didn't know it was possible to fold laundry wrong. I apparently was wrong. I learned that there was a right way to fold laundry, and I needed to figure out and agree with that right way. I'm not going to say who dictated that, but I live with one other person, so I'll let you guess. I figured it out, and we got through it, and you know what? We no longer have activating conversations about laundry. But when you think about any relationship you're in, it's amazing the things that normally may not bug you, but with a particular person or a particular group, they may activate you. And therefore, in those conversations, you know those conversations because you notice yourself becoming more reactive. And if our goal tonight is to learn how to become more responsive and less reactive, then that is the warning light going off in your head saying, hey, maybe I should implement some sort of a model to make myself more responsive in this moment. My hope tonight is that the conversation highway could be that model that you may choose. So let's talk about it a little bit. We're going to start with the sensory on-ramp. So the sensory on-ramp notices a behavior or a mood with one or more of your senses. Obviously, we're talking about sight, we're talking about hearing, smell, touch, and we're talking about taste. I don't imagine that you would have many conversations where taste would come into play, but if you're at a restaurant and you want to talk to the chef, maybe so. Let's take a look at a couple of examples here that we're going to be following along with during our model to kind of flesh out what it would look like to notice something and then express it to somebody else. So we have these two examples. We're going to be following along with someone at a party, and then we're going to be following along with someone at home talking to a family member. So our first conversation says, hey, I saw you walked out of the party without saying goodbye. And then the second one, I heard you yelling in your room. And those seem like very easy sentences to communicate, but what's really interesting about them is it's representing or it's noticing a sense and it's expressing it to someone else. And that creates a very inviting start to a conversation. Well, why is that important? Let's take a look at the next slide here, and we look at sensory on-ramp. We notice that if we speed into the on-ramp, if we speed into the highway too fast, we may cause a conversation wreck. This is what that might look like. Hey, I saw that. What's the matter with you? That sounds a lot more accusatory than I noticed you left the party, or I heard some yelling up in your room. So if we come in too fast on the on-ramp into our little highway, just like going on to I-80 or coming up 370, if you come in too fast, you might cause yourself a little wreck. So you got to be careful about that. This is an interesting note from, once again, the Gottman Institute. They find the first 3 minutes of a conversation can determine if a conflict will arise 96% of the time. So we really got to make sure if we're coming into a conversation and we want to get into this highway with somebody, let's do it cautiously. Let's do it slowly. Let's notice things rather than make assumptions or accusations. An easy way to remember this is something called an I statement. It's very easy by saying, I noticed, or I saw that, or I heard that, or I felt something was a little off. You're starting a conversation with yourself rather than the opposite, which is called a you statement, which is, what's the matter with you? Or why are you acting so weird? Or you never yell, what's up? And when we start a conversation with a you statement, we automatically criticize, even though it may not be our intention, which, if you remember, will start that cycle of conflict and cause possibly some defensiveness in response. And without even intending to do so, within the first few seconds or the first couple of minutes of a conversation, we may have created a conflict, even though our intentions were much more magnanimous, were much more altruistic than what we were intending to do. So we want to be really careful when we come into a conversation. Imagine getting onto a highway, taking that on-ramp, slowly speeding up and getting ready to merge into traffic. And as you're doing that, use some I statements and just comment on the things that you noticed. And why is that so important? Well, because you really don't know anything more than what you have observed. And if you go too far, you may insinuate things that actually weren't there beyond what you just noticed with your 5 senses. So as we get started in conversations, we want to stay in the sensory on-ramp. We want to come in slowly. We do not want to presume or infer what a person is thinking or feeling on their behavior. We don't want to barrel in too quickly. We don't want to come in asking questions because we might cause a car wreck. I was working with a couple just last year, and just a wonderful couple. I work with a lot of couples. Last year we were working together, and the wife kept commenting on why the husband was doing what he was doing. And every single time that happened, even though the conversation was very neutral and it was very congenial and respectful, every single time that happened, I saw the husband sit back and cross his arms. And if you know anything about nonverbal behavior, that's a defensive pose. And it was really interesting to watch because every single time she brought something up, she was inferring what she thought her husband was thinking based off his behavior. The fancy term for that is called psychoanalysis. And you want to be really, really careful if you're going to psychoanalyze anyone. So fortunately, in our sessions together, we were able to recognize that. And I'm just so proud of her and both of them because she was able to kind of restrain herself more from that and start stopping herself and just saying, I noticed he was doing that. and period. Nothing after. And it was amazing to see his response, because instead of seeing the arms crossed, he would still sit there open, listening and ready to respond to what was going on. So it's incredible the power of just relinquishing a couple of words and condensing what you want to say to specifically an I statement about what you noticed or what you saw or what you sensed. So let's not presume, let's not infer. Let's make sure that we only pick up on what we're seeing right in front of us. If we can successfully come in the on-ramp, and now we're in the highway, let's move into the emotions lane. Most conversations start with the emotions. We tend to notice emotions first. So it only makes sense that we should respond to the emotions first. Here's what we know. Expressing how the behaviors you sense made you feel, as well as exploring how the other person may be feeling. That's the goal of this lane. Let's go back to our examples. Let's see if we can follow along. So once again, we have a party scenario up top, and we have a household dilemma going on down below. So it says here, I felt sad to see you leave, and it made me wonder if everything's okay. Down below, I felt surprised by the yelling, which made me curious about how you're feeling. And right there, we've entered into our conversation. We've used some I statements. We've been gentle and cautious. We're having this conversation now about emotions. We're mentioning our own emotions. And that's so important because you want to let the person or persons know how you're feeling. And it can be so simple and so quick as something as simple as, oh, I felt so sad when I saw you leaving. I'm wondering what's going on. Or I was really surprised to hear you yelling. That doesn't usually happen. I'm very curious about what's on your mind or how you're feeling right now. Once again, we're trying to invite more conversation. Why are we trying to invite more conversation? Because we know the first 3 minutes of a conversation will predict how well that conversation goes 96% of the time. So we want to enter in with the emotions, and we want to reference our emotions because we have emotions. And then we want to explore and do two things. We want to empathize and validate the emotions of the other person. What do those words mean? So empathize and validate. That's going to be the goal in the emotions lane. Empathy tries to understand another person's perspective from their perspective, which is a very hard thing to actually do. Noted psychologist and textbook author Edward Newkrug, he says in his book, I believe it's The World of the Counselor, the goal of the counselor is to get into the world of the person they're working with. And that is what empathy is when we're interacting with our clients in our offices. That's really the goal. What we see here in our example, empathy, once again, tries to understand another person's perspective from their perspective. Let's take a look at the example here. I hear you saying that this party makes you feel lonely since no one has talked to you. I can see how that would feel lonely. So we're trying to get into their world, and we're trying to understand their perspective from their perspective. Most people understand someone's actions from our perspective alone. And that's about as far as we can go. So if I'm seeing someone at a party who's leaving the party and I'm having a great time at the party, I will see that, but I will think to myself, there's something wrong with them because this party is awesome. So why are you leaving this thing? Empathy is that extra step of trying to understand what's going on from their perspective. And if we can do that, we may be able to invite further conversation. We also maybe invite further conversation by validating how they may be feeling or validating how we're feeling. Validation acknowledges and values emotions in the conversation. We have another example we can follow along with. What I'm hearing you say is that you feel overwhelmed, which is why you're yelling. It's totally reasonable to feel overwhelmed. I don't know how many moms and dads have had the chance to really sit down with their kids and say, you know what, it is reasonable, it's totally understandable to feel overwhelmed. That makes a lot of sense. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. And even that little validation could eliminate any defensiveness that may be going on inside of that person. So if we could validate even just a little bit, And validation it's a pretty simple task to understand. It's hard to implement. We're trying to identify how we or they feel. We're trying to explain how we feel and maybe they feel. And then we're trying to evaluate that. We're trying to say to ourselves, hey, is it reasonable to feel the emotion that I have right now? Reasonable is a key word, not right, not wrong. Emotions aren't moral, they're emotional. Is it reasonable? Does it make sense in this context, in the situation, that this person's feeling this way? That's what we're trying to do when we validate. Validate values emotions. And how do we do that? Once again, we identify how we're feeling and how the other person's feeling. We explain why, so we figure out what is the context that's making me feel this way, and then we evaluate it. We ask ourselves, hey, is it reasonable right now that I'm feeling the emotion that I'm feeling? Very importantly, don't ignore emotions or rush through them, as this tends to wreck a conversation. Got to tell you about another client of mine, a wonderful man who we've been working together now for the last few months. A very transparent person, very analytical person. And we're also doing couples counseling together. And just recently, we were having a session, and he recognized that what he does most often is races across the emotion lane as fast as possible. Because he does not value or understand emotions very well. He doesn't see a lot of reason to talk about emotions. So when he has a conversation with his wife or with his kids or even with coworkers, there is no time spent in the emotion lane. And it was fascinating to hear him admit that as I was watching his wife. And his wife started breaking down. And she goes, I can't believe you finally admitted that, because I feel like you bulldoze over my emotions every single time we talk. And it could be a strength. He's a very analytical person. So I think it's wonderful that he wants to get into the thoughts, and he wants to share insights, and he wants to start thinking through logically. But the fact that he was just racing through the emotion lane was leaving people in the dust, leaving people in his path. And it was really, really exciting to watch them revert some of those patterns and see how his wife began to feel more validated. She would start saying things like, I actually think you understand what I'm saying, which for them was remarkable. It was fantastic to watch. But we can easily start to work with each other if we go through the emotions lane and we merge into the thoughts lane. Importantly, we have to make that merge. We can't just go straight from the on-ramp across to the left lane. Let's not do that. Let's try to stay in the emotions lane, and then we'll merge over. What does that mean? Well, the thoughts lane is sharing insights about what you notice while exploring what the other person is thinking. Going back to our examples on the board, I think getting away from the crowd is occasionally a good idea, and I'd be happy to hear what's on your mind if you'd like to share. Going back to the household incident, I think you're usually a pretty calm person, so I'd love to learn what's on your mind that's making you so upset. Sharing a little bit of insight and then inviting them to share their own thoughts and their own opinions. Importantly, some conversations never need to go to the thoughts lane. Some conversations can reach a resolution purely through emotional responses. I'll say that once again, maybe for the guys in the room. Sometimes we never need the thoughts lane. We never need to get to the logical, the analytical. Sometimes we can reach a resolution just by staying in the emotions and validating and empathizing with each other. If needed, ask yourself whether or not you have the other person's or the other group's permission to share your insights. This can be really, really tough. You got a friend, their life is falling apart. You see all of the flaws, you see all of the cracks, you see all the mistakes, and you're like, I can fix this for you. Let me tell you what you need to do. And you start laying into them, you start saying you need to get rid of that guy, you need to stop talking to your boss that way, you need to find a new job. And then your friend's face just downcast, and they just stop. And you realize too late, oh, I didn't actually have any permission to share my thoughts with you. You just wanted me to listen. You just wanted me to be a sounding board. But I went right into the thoughts lane, and I shared my insights without really thinking whether or not I have your permission to share. And that's a really common thing. It's something that I do all the time. I think we all do it because we want to help. And sharing our insights is helpful, but it's only helpful if we have permission to do so. And I think a lot of us, we overlook that vital step. Importantly, we don't always have to ask for permission verbally or in the context of the conversation. There's a lot of times where we already feel like, or we know we have permission because of the nature of the relationship, or maybe the context of the situation. I think we have another example right behind me. Yelling is not an encouraged behavior in our home, so I have a contextual precedent to tell her that I think this isn't like her. Up on top, this person already told me how they felt about the party, so it seems like I have their permission to share my thoughts about it too. This internal conversation with yourself, this internal dialogue that you're having, gauging whether or not you have permission to share, that could elevate a relationship immensely if you pay attention to permission. Parents, maybe you have a teenager at home, and maybe that teenager is making some bad choices. Not harmful, maybe not moralistically an issue, but just bad choices. And you see that, and you're like, I can fix this for you. Just listen to me. If you get up half an hour earlier, you won't be 10 minutes late to school every single day. Or maybe they just went through their first breakup. And you want to tell them, hey, just so you know, you're 15 years old, you got your entire life ahead of you, you probably weren't going to marry them in the first place. Hey, guess what? Factually, you're right. They do not care. I think there's a lot of times where we don't ask ourselves, hey, do I have permission to share my insights? And when we don't ask whether or not we have permission, sometimes we end up in conversation wrecks. We end up stalled. We end up breaking down in communication. Permission, we already covered that. We're in good shape. Let's move on to the resolution off-ramp. So a resolution may be a plan, could be a plan of action, a mutual understanding, or it could be an agreement. When we look at the examples behind us, we see, going from the top with our party example, thanks so much for sharing with me. I understand that going home will make you feel better. Let's plan to check in with each other tomorrow. I love that plan. I love the fact that we're validating each other, we're empathizing, and we're moving forward. And then let's take a look at the bottom when we have this household conflict. It sounds like there's a lot on your mind. Did talking about it feel relieving at all? I'm so glad. Let's talk more after dinner. We find ourselves having a little plan of action going on there. Arriving at a resolution does not always require action steps. I want to tell you about another client of mine. Her name's Christina, and a really incredible person who I had the opportunity to work with about 2.5 years ago. Very A-type person, a go-getter, very ambitious, very successful. She works a high-level job, and we're seeing her with her husband in the room, doing some couples counseling together, and what we're realizing is that Christina was constantly trying to get action after every single conversation. Some sort of decision made, some sort of plan put together, some sort of strategy to follow after every single activating situation needed a conversation. And it was really interesting to watch Christina's husband as we were discussing what this looks like and how she just interacts with everybody. Because apparently this is just how she would act with everyone. It made her very successful professionally is what it sounds like. Her husband said, I feel so exhausted trying to have conversations that I just stopped trying, and I would rather keep my mouth shut and not rock the boat than have to figure out another 5-step plan after sharing my feelings about dinner. It was a really interesting conversation to have, and Christina, who was a very open-minded person, and I really appreciated the fact that she was willing to hear what her husband had to say and receive feedback. She recognized it, And the way that she worked through that was by relinquishing the need for an action to be taken after every single conversation that they had. It made a profound difference in their marriage. Why? Well, because one of the three main reasons why conversations break down, you might remember, is the cycle of avoidance. And this had been going on in their marriage for about 20 years. Her husband felt like he could never speak his mind because he would always cause a bigger problem in the solution part than the problem was by itself. You know, it's like all of those wonderful pharmaceutical commercials. The side effects are actually worse than whatever they heal or they solve. That seemed to be what was going on in their relationship. And when they were able to figure that out and rectify it, it dramatically changed his willingness to share what was on his heart on a regular basis. And it relieved so much pressure and expectations on Christina. She wasn't disappointed nearly as much because she felt like, hey, you know what? We can have a resolution together with understanding or even with an agreement. We don't have to get straight to action steps, and make something happen. Let's talk about a mutual understanding versus agreement real quick so you guys can understand what that looks like. So a mutual understanding is understanding that we have different opinions. Maybe they're very closely aligned, but to some degree they might be similar, but they are different. And we can understand that the way I'm thinking about the situation and the way that you're thinking or a group of people's thinking is just, it's not quite there. And I will respect your opinion, and I understand it, and you can respect my opinion, and you can understand it as well. And we can leave the conversation there. We can move on, we can go our separate ways, or we can come back to it at a later date. An agreement, obviously, is when our understandings align, when they match. I will say when you're in family relationships, when you're in marriages, the chances of you getting by with mutual understanding alone, pretty small. Which is why we also need to recognize that resolutions don't have to immediately happen in conversations. Sometimes a conversation could last days, weeks, months, maybe even years before we arrive at an agreement together, especially if we're in close relationship. Usually the closer the relationship, the longer the leash before we need to arrive as a resolution. Here in Omaha, over on the north side of town, there's a nonprofit community center called the Hope Center. I'm not sure if anyone in here has ever heard of that before. I had the opportunity to study and kind of get mentored under the founders of that Hope Center a long time ago. Their names were Ty and Terry Schinzel. And really incredible, wonderful people. They made a huge impact in the city. Ty wrote a book about his experience creating the Hope Center in North Omaha. And it's really fascinating the way he explained it, because he said he came to the idea of creating a community center in North Omaha for the community of North Omaha sometime in the early 90s. I think it was about 91, 92, something like that. He told his wife, Terry, about it. She was not on board. And then he described what he called as a dream pregnancy, where he was pregnant with this dream for like 5-6 years and not pressuring his wife to move forward, not doing anything to create a resolution artificially, but just kind of sitting and living with that dream and allowing he and his wife to sit on this conversation highway for a long, long time before they could reach an agreement together. I love that model because it reminds me the closer the relationship is, the longer the leash we may need before we can get to a resolution. And that is perfectly okay. There's no need to rush a conversation. If a conversation included the thoughts lane, ask about emotions before wrapping up. Take a look at another example here. Thanks for sharing with me. I understand that going home will make you feel better. Let's plan to check in with each other tomorrow. Just like when you merge out of a highway, once again, you don't hit the off-ramp from the left lane. So we need to merge back into the emotions. We need to check in. We need to make sure, hey, did this conversation feel good? Did it feel like you were included? Did you feel like you were those two important words? Were you validated? Do you feel like we empathize with each other in how we were feeling and what we were thinking? And then we move off into the resolution together. But we don't want to skip over the emotion lane because, just like any highway, you got to come through the right lane before you can get to the off-ramp. So let's make sure that we do that when we reach those resolutions. Unless absolutely necessary, do not force a resolution in a conversation. I think this is what made the biggest difference in Christina's story. Because when she stopped pressing the issue, and for her it was specifically an action step, but when she stopped pressing the issue, it really made the resolution so much less of a priority, and it made the journey so much more of the focus, which allowed her husband to share more freely without feeling pressured to get to some sort of solution. We want to create better conversations, better communication. I believe the conversation highway model can get you there. Why? Because it's going to help you become more responsive and less reactive. Once again, the goal of tonight, let's become more responsive and less reactive. As we're wrapping up, I wanted to share with you guys a couple of potholes to avoid in conversations, because every highway has a good pothole in it. So let's pay attention to the ones in conversations. Do you struggle with a fix-it mentality? What does that mean? Well, conversations struggle when we mainly focus on fixing each other's problems. Why is this? Well, this mentality typically skips over the emotions lane, which tends to cause a lot of wrecked conversations. Do you find yourself looking for solutions quickly rather than listening and staying present in the conversation with the person or the persons you're talking to? Let's avoid the fix-it mentality. Are you harboring contempt? Contempt uses grudges against someone from previous offenses to link present conflicts with former conflicts. I call this carrying emotional baggage from the past into your present. If we have contempt in our conversations, words like always or never are typically going to indicate that that is present. John Gottman, once again from the Gottman Institute, he lists contempt as one of the 4 largest destroyers of marriages. He calls them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And right there next to criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling is contempt. So before you walk into a conversation, if you're saying things like you always do this or you never do that, if you have a memory bank full of resentment and bitterness from past experiences, you may not be giving the conversation you're in a fair shot. You also may be falling victim to the blame game, which is one of the 3 primary reasons that conversations tend to break down. You might have presuppositions about the other person or persons before you've even started the conversation. Contempt is a you problem. It's not a we problem. You need to work on that. You need to fix that. You need to maybe forgive. You need to accept. You need to come to some sort of resolution within yourself so that you can see the conversation neutrally for what it is. Are we harboring contempt in our conversations? And lastly is presumptions. Predetermining someone's thoughts and feelings based on their behavior usually ignores empathy and creates a judgmental perspective. Whether it's coming from a contemptuous place, which is going to be more malignant, or if it's just coming from a psychoanalytical place, which is you're trying to figure out and tell people exactly how they think and how they feel based off their behavior, presuming tends to break down conversations very quickly. So let's watch out for that in our potholes. I shared a lot of information with you guys tonight, and I wouldn't expect you to remember all of it at all. Our big goal tonight is becoming more responsive and less reactive. I've seen this happen in my counseling sessions. I've seen this happen in my ministry experiences. I want to share one last story with you before I let you go and we switch over to the Q&A time. But I want to talk about a client of mine named Wes that I had about a year ago. And Wes was dealing with a lot of wounds from his parents, along with his current family, his wife and his kids. Wes was a very reactive person. Wes had a hard time hearing even the most neutral of conversations without internalizing it as I did something wrong. And because he was such a reactive person, he came to me as he was trying to figure out whether or not to get a divorce. And we started talking about the differences between responsiveness and reactivity. And Wes started to realize that he was harboring a lot of contempt. Wes was starting to realize that he was dealing with a lot of avoidance issues, and he had a lot of defensiveness. And he was able to become more reactive and less responsive. His marriage started to recover. His wife started going to see a therapist of her own. During the time that Wes and I were meeting, his dad, who had terminal cancer, went on hospice. Wes had never really forgiven his dad for the things that happened to him when he was a child. This is a man in his 50s. We're talking about decades of resentment and bitterness. Because Wes was becoming more responsive, because he was dealing with the contempt in his heart, Wes was able to go to his dad daily for the last 2 weeks of his dad's life, reconnect with the man that he had pushed away for 2, 3, 4 decades. I'm not saying that's because of what we did individually in our sessions, but I am saying it's because Les learned how to become more responsive in his own heart, individually, and also in his conversations. I've seen it work. It's remarkable. It's amazing. If you're sitting here tonight and you're wondering, can I ever have a good, productive conversation ever again? Wes would tell you, yes, you can. Don't let me tell you. Let Wes tell you. I'll just be the one to talk about it. Really appreciate you guys' time tonight. I want to open it up for some Q&A as we have, about 20 minutes left. What I'd like to do in the back, I have some questions for you while you have some questions for me. I think that's only fair. You guys are going to pepper me with questions. I'm going to do it back to you. So here's some things to think about on the board for your own life. Can the avoidance or conflict cycles be affecting your conversations? What about the blame game? If yes, how so? Maybe that's something for you to reflect on tonight. How could you become more responsive in your conversations? I believe everybody has strengths, and I'm sure tonight, as you guys were listening to some of the parts of the conversation highway model, you're probably like, oh, I've got that down. And that's not hubris. Maybe you really do. Which steps of the conversation highway do you do well? Maybe you're really good at sensing or noticing when something isn't quite right with people around you. Maybe you're really good at recognizing and validating feelings. Maybe you have a gift for sharing your insights and listening for others' opinions as well. Maybe you're the type of person where you are asking yourself, do I have permission to share right now? Maybe that's you. Maybe you're really good at resolving conversations. Why? Because you understand we can achieve a mutual understanding. We could achieve an agreement. We don't have to always land at an action step in order to resolve this. What are you doing well? And then lastly, are there parts of the conversation highway that you could improve? If so, how could you start improving them? Things to think about. All right, those are my questions for you. Do you have any questions for me?
Check. If you have a question, I'll bring it to you. There you go.
My name's John,
Hi, John.
and I have a sister-in-law who has a loving relationship with her daughter. Daughter lives some distance away. And as a lead-up to the election, they had some very harsh conversations, and the daughter said, I'm not going to talk to you ever again. And you're not going to be able to talk to your granddaughter. And she talked to me, and she wouldn't accept a text, a phone call, FaceTime. And I said, well, write her a personal letter. Lay out your heart. Tell her what you're feeling. You're her mother. You love each other. Mm-hmm. And let it set for a while. Mm-hmm. And she did that, and there's not been much improvement. This has been several months going on. And I think the mutual conversation, mutual understanding you talked about is something I'll write her about. But any thoughts that I might share with her on this issue?
That's a great question. I will say that's a much broader question than just a conversation. It's going to be a long line of it. What I'm hearing is probably steps towards reconciliation. And here's what's really hard about reconciliation. It's two people or more that are involved. Reconciliation starts with an apologetic posture. And your sister, she could have an apologetic posture. And that's probably the best place for her to be. What that's going to mean is that your sister is going to have to, on probably a regular basis, because this is probably going to go on for more months, she's probably going to have to consistently forgive the pain of distance and separation and the ignoring behavior from her daughter in order to remain apologetically open. I did a couple of different seminars when I was working with a nonprofit, and we would go around the world. And I was in China, and we were having some very similar conversations like the one you're having right now. And we had a hard time explaining what we were trying to say because there was a language barrier, and our translator was trying really, really hard. So instead, we just used hand movements. And what we're looking for when it comes to people trying to reconcile, we're looking for this. This is facing the problem with open hands, being willing to listen. A lot of people in that situation, one or both, are probably like this, where their arms are crossed, they're not interested in anything, and they're facing away from the situation. What your sister could do, and it's probably the best thing that she can do because she can't control her daughter, is to remain like this, which is by far probably the hardest thing your sister's going to have to do because it means on a daily basis she's going to have to forgive the pain of doing this to the back of someone who's doing this. And that's incredibly painful. I hope if your sister can do this and remain this way, sooner or later she's going to get reward on her investment. I really do. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm.
That was a great question. Yeah.
Hello, my name's Sydney.
Hi, Sydney.
I have a question about raising voices and yelling. In my family where I came from, we didn't do a whole lot of that, and my father typically, didn't encourage that. I think he got yelled at a lot as a kid, and his mom was kind of not the best when it came to the relationship. How do you handle that, like, in your own family now away? If, like, your married family members or people the other family you married into tend to yell and, like, escalate?
Yeah.
When you
Is it
don't wanna-
always yelling and escalating out of anger? Is it excitement, elation? Is it just a loud family? What's it like?
It's typically an anger or a hurt reaction, I would think, more than anything.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
it's almost like a, this is how you're supposed to do it,
Mhm.
and why aren't you doing it with me kind of thing,
Okay.
and how to
Yeah,
respond to
Very
that.
interesting.
Yeah.
So I understand your question. What I'm hearing you say is you come from a family that was more reserved and restrained when it comes to like verbal behavior, and you're trying to understand how to interact with your in-law family, which is very loud and boisterous. Okay, very expressive. All right, fair enough. So first off, where are you at with your family? Are you guys on the same page? Are we unified here? Okay, good. So you guys understand how you want to create your family, regardless of your families of origin. Is that correct?
I think so. Sometimes that's a little rocky too.
Okay. Yeah. So for you guys to figure out what your nuclear family is going to be is probably priority number one.
Okay.
So do you guys want to be boisterous? Do you guys want to be very expressive? So my wife is Hispanic.
Okay.
And she comes from a very proud Mexican family. And the first time I went to Christmas, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm 6'2", 200 pounds, and I'm in the corner because nobody's talking to me at all. I have never felt so invisible in my life. But that's the world that she comes from. So her and I, we're trying to figure out what is our family going to be.
Yeah.
And what's the mixture there? So for you guys, let's get on the same page with what you want your nuclear family to look like. And then what we're going to have to do with your in-laws, we're going to have to figure out boundaries because we can't control them.
Yeah.
So can we, I would say enjoy time with them in either small doses or smaller interactions so that we don't become personally overwhelmed with a lot of the hostility and the anger and just like figuring this out through what it would be aggressive conversations.
Okay.
Boundaries is probably going to be the best thing to do with your in-laws, but you can only get there if you guys are unified in your nuclear family.
Yeah.
So that's priority number one. It sounds like you guys are doing a great job there. With your in-law family, if it's hurting your marriage or it's hurting you guys, then we need to prioritize you over anybody else.
Yeah.
And that's a really hard truth, but we can absolutely do that. Once you have boundaries put in place, then I think the way that you start righting that ship, you're going to start modeling the behavior you want to see. And I think that's how you would do it at Christmas and Thanksgiving and stuff like that. That'd be great, but it only works if you have the boundaries set up first in your family, and you have unity in your family on how you want to interact together, and then we can start modeling the behavior you want to see in your in-laws' events and interactions. So that'd be 3 different steps that I would see working the best.
Okay.
Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Great.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah. Very good.
I was wondering if your thoughts change any when the 2 people are not on the same level of power, such as a boss and a subordinate.
Yeah. And when you're asking that question, when we're not on the same level, so boss, subordinate, are you talking about in just conversation? Are you talking about something deeper than that? What are you looking for there?
Well, so if you have, my former supervisor was in a position over me, and she was not afraid to use her position to be a bully. And so if there were other people around, she was smart enough to behave herself, but in other situations, she was pretty brutal and ruthless, and you're not on the same playing field to be able to, I think maybe she just had a very narcissistic personality, and I think that you don't necessarily want to tell her, well, I feel, really sad when you talk to me like that, because they just perceive that to be a weakness that it's never going to help you.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you had some general thoughts on dealing with difficult people like that.
Great question. That's a really, really good question. And I would even broaden that, because most professional relationships, they're really, unless you're in a great team that's made a conscious effort to focus on like individuals' emotions throughout the day, most professional relationships don't care too much about how you feel about what's going on. It's all performance-based. So I think you bring up a really good point. First thing I would say is that you're engaging with a toxic person. So when we're engaging with a toxic person, this type of stuff is probably not going to work out so great, okay? Because they are operating with a different MO than you are. You're looking for some sort of resolution, maybe some unity. You're looking to make peace out of a chaotic situation. Most toxic people, as you're describing, they're looking to push their own agenda and get what they want. And that's like their biggest goal. So when you're working with a toxic person, it's probably not going to work so well to try to empathize with them as much. What you can do is you can validate yourself and try to work through how you're feeling on your own so that you don't fall into a victim mentality when it comes to your professional and your personal life. So what is a victim mentality? That's where we believe that we are hopeless and helpless in everything that we do. Because a victim truly is hopeless and helpless in everything that they do. So if we fall into that mentality at work, we're probably going to start feeling more depressed and hopeless at home. And our personal life is going to become affected because of our professional relationships. What you can do is you can start validating how you feel. What I'd recommend is maybe taking some time at the end of the day to write it down. I felt overwhelmed. I felt bulldozed. I felt steamrolled, whatever the word is you want to use. Remember, the 3 different steps to validation is identifying, explaining, and evaluating. So if you can do that for yourself, you're going to give your own mentality an opportunity to process through how you were made to feel. And hopefully you can remind yourself, hey, you know what? I may be helpless as a subordinate in my job, but I am not helpless and hopeless in other aspects of my life. I have choices. And the validation step, even when we do it with ourselves, can really help us process the emotion so that we can start seeing the picture from a broader standpoint and try to get a little bit more disconnected from the daily abuse that you're probably feeling from a toxic person. Does that make sense? So I would encourage you to validate yourself, even keep a little journal. Wow, today I felt really condescended. And I feel like my boss was just making a lot of accusations toward me that weren't true, and that was just completely unfair. Was it reasonable to feel that way? Yeah, it was reasonable to feel that way. That's perfectly fine. I can acknowledge that. I can accept that. I don't have to live in that tonight. And I can go through that. Another thing to think about is if you have an HR department, you might want to go and talk to them about what's going on, because a toxic behavior with a supervisor or a manager, I mean, that's something that probably a company-wide is going to suffer from. Why do we say that? Well, because we always have options. The more times we recognize options that we can pursue, the less we're going to feel like a victim. Because a victim is helpless and hopeless. Does that make sense? It's a great question. I think I'd take probably a lot more individual conversation to fully answer it. Did it answer your question well enough in the 5 minutes we had together? Okay. Thanks so much for asking.
Great question. Anybody else? Sir? Okay. How we doing for time? Good.
Think we're doing okay? Got about 10 minutes left?
Nice.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kim. Is there any advice you could give us older people as we interact with those that may be in their teens or 20s? They rely so much on texting, and so how do the dynamics of this fit into that mode of communication?
Over texting?
Yes.
Great question. So you're going to lose inflection, you're going to lose tone, you're going to lose a lot of nonverbal communication. So right there, we can work around that, but we're going to have to be a little bit more descriptive in our texts. Be a lot more intentional with the things that you want to say. I think what I've noticed between intergenerational relationships, there's not a lot of empathy. Once again, empathy, as I understand it, is to understand someone's perspective from their perspective. So if we're trying to interact with, let's say, a Gen Z as a baby boomer, or we're maybe a Gen X, we're trying to, I think it's called Generation Alpha now. Is that the next one coming up? Yeah. So we're trying to interact. Well, the younger generation is not going to have a lot of cognizant development to do this exercise like you would. So that means with the ability to empathize comes the responsibility to empathize. And I think that's where I would probably start. And the way I would do that with my texts, I would try to be pretty descriptive. I would try to say things like, tell me more, or that's so exciting, what else is going on with your life? Open-ended questions over text could be really helpful. What's an open-ended question? That's something that invites more conversation. So we would start questions with what, how, or why to elicit an open-ended question response. If you say, do you like your day? Or, what do you like about your day is much more open than did you like your day. If you say something like, did you like your day? Well, it's a closed question. Chances are you're going to get a yes or a no response, and then you're dependent on the person to expand. And if you're working with a teenager, they're not going to expand. So you take that opportunity away from them by saying, hey, what did you like about your day? How did your day go? That's interesting. Tell me more about that. And when you're texting back and forth, I think you can ask those kind of open-ended questions to try to get more conversation. Just know that they're probably going to be more self-centered, so they may not text very much. Frequency can be important. That could be really good. But younger people tend to be more self-centered because they haven't been taught that their life probably shouldn't revolve around them. As we get older, we become more other-centered. So we start focusing on other relationships. The way that you could combat that is try to empathize with the younger generation and try to be a little more descriptive in your texts. I think that's how I would summarize my answer. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yep.
There we go. Let's see. Maybe I'll scoot through here if that's okay.
Hi, my name's Jocelyn. And my husband, Dave, and we have a 10-year-old. We just have one child. And he's very energetic, full of life, great kid, great student, loving, wonderful. So this isn't anything against my son, but sometimes he gets worked up about different things. And my husband and I have very different approaches to discipline. My husband's very laid back, kind of let things happen, and maybe approach it later. And I'm a very verbal, want to take care of the situation right away. And if I notice that something, my son is saying something that's not using, kind words or a kind approach towards something, I'll say, Jonah, I didn't like the sound of that. That's not okay to talk to someone that way. And then I feel like since I'm addressing these things, that I'm kind of constantly the bad guy. And Jonah's not doing anything wrong. He's 10. Like I said, he's a great kid. We don't have issues with him.
Yeah.
But it's just a different approach towards discipline. And then sometimes I feel resentment towards my husband because I'm like, why am I put in this situation where I feel like I'm the bad guy? But I can't blame my husband because that's his natural approach, and we just have a different angle on things. So, I guess what can you come up with?
Where do we go from there?
You've given everyone great answers, and this has been amazing. I just
good.
yeah, I appreciate everything that you've shared tonight.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Great question, parenting question. So this would be a wonderful opportunity to have a conversation highway model type of conversation about principles and preferences. All parents in the room, are we having conversations about principles and preferences in our parenting? What do I mean by that? Well, principles are non-negotiables as a family unit. Are we enforcing the principles that we've established as a family? Preferences are unique to both parents. So, Jocelyn, what I'm hearing from you is it sounds like you might have a preference for more calm and respectful language, and your husband might have a longer leash for that. Yes. Now, what we want to figure out is what's the principle that you guys are in unity on when it comes to language, respectful language. We want to figure out what the measuring stick is for that, and we need to enforce that principle regardless of whether or not the other parent is in the room. Preferences need to be respected. Principles need to be enforced. We probably need to have a conversation about how you feel when a principle that you have is not enforced by your husband, so that way he can understand kind of the resentment or the anger you feel there. But at the same time, if you guys haven't had a proactive conversation about what are principles in our household and what are principles that we have as parents, chances are your husband may not even know that he's stepping on your toes by letting Jonah do whatever he wants, so to speak. Does that make sense? So I really encourage all parents to have conversations about what are the principles that we're going to enforce as a unit, and then what are the preferences that we individually want to see that we can respect in one another. Does that make
It does.
answer
Thank
the
you.
question? Yeah, absolutely.
I appreciate it.
While Bryce is walking the microphone to somebody else, I'm going to ask the back over there. Jeff, can you bring up that City Care slide? Yeah, this is perfect. So tonight is part of an effort that City Care has been doing for a while, and really trying to dive into that this year by creating more opportunities to care for our community through free trainings and workshops and presentations. One thing that would really help us out tonight is if you guys could give us some feedback just by scanning this QR code behind me and then answering a couple of quick questions in a survey. So that way we can understand if this has been helpful and effective, and maybe there are some things we can improve along the way. I'd really appreciate that. All right, and if we can leave that on the board, that'd be great. I'm happy to take a couple of more questions if we have time for it.
Okay. Any other questions?
Oh, sure, yeah. I don't think that's going to help you much. Yep.
Let's go back in here. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Tammy. So how do you rearrange like my thinking when somebody's talking to me and I'm already forming in my mind everything I want to say back? Where do I stop and say, or how do I stop my mind from thinking what I'm going to say and listen?
Yeah, great question. You said your name was Tammy, is that right?
Yes.
Thanks for asking the question, Tammy. Sounds like you are probably an incredible debater. So that could be a strength, and I always like to see weaknesses through an eyes of strength. So maybe you're very good at speaking your own mind and asserting yourself, and that could be a strength. I think what you mentioned at the end there could be really key. How can you become a better listener? We need to practice what's called active listening skills. Here's the easiest one. When you're listening to somebody, force yourself to say this: what I'm hearing you say is, and then summarize.
Repeat it back. Or in
Force
my
yourself to
mind?
do that.
Okay, in my mind?
Yep.
Or do I repeat it back to them?
Every time you're having a conversation and you're developing a rebuttal or some sort of thought, you got to stop yourself and you got to say, what I'm hearing you say is, and then summarize, because that is a fundamental active listening skill that if we can do it in a very practical way, we can learn to stop thinking of responses and we can learn to start listening to what's going on.
Okay.
So what I'm hearing you say is, and then summarize. And you're going to be really bad at it at first, and that's okay, because then you can say, did I hear you correctly? And they will say no. And then you can say, could you tell me again? And then you can work through it, and you're going to get better and better and better. And sooner or later, you're going to be able to listen and absorb what people have to say, and then you can formulate your own thought and reply to it. But what I'm hearing you say is, and then summarize, is a really great fundamental active listening skill.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I think this will be the last question before we wrap up here. Great questions, you guys. Awesome.
Hello, I'm Amy. A parenting question for you. In today's society, with kids being so involved in technology, what helpful things would you instill in parents to help their kids be better at communicating?
Okay. Can I ask some clarifying questions real quick, if you
Sure,
don't mind?
yeah.
Communicating with who? Superiors, adults, peers?
I would just say in general with communication, like I just feel like the generation that's coming up is gonna really struggle just because they've been so heavily involved with technology and they just aren't equipped with the communication skills that maybe we all are.
Right, yeah, that's fair. So if it's just in general and kind of a universal response, what I would focus on are probably going to be some of the most fundamental things that we can do. So when you're working with your kids, and this can be anywhere and everywhere, but stop them and make sure they have eye contact when you're talking to them. That's a really easy thing. I didn't ask, how old are your kids?
7 and 10.
Okay, yeah. So that's probably a decent age where you can still stop them, you can still gather their attention and say, hey, I want you to looking at me when we talk. That's going to be a really basic, fundamental one. Another one is exactly what I was telling Tammy over here. When I say something, I want you to summarize what you heard me saying. Just repeat back to me what you heard, because that's going to prove that they're retaining or they're comprehending what you're saying rather than just kind of blowing you off. When it comes to technology, you know, technology it's a really wonderful thing. It can be a really dangerous thing. Technology is a thing. It's how we use it that dictates it. So are there ways that you can encourage them to talk to people over text in ways that are going to be more open-ended question and try to get into their world when they're talking to their friends? I think that could be interesting when it comes to texting conversations. When they're talking to friends, I'd imagine you got 2 boys at home, is that right?
Girl and a boy.
Okay, girl and a boy. So if they're playing any type of video games with friends, or maybe they're watching something together, they're probably just making statements without asking questions. And that's what most kids do. They just make statements, and then they just move on, or they try to be funny, or they say something that they think is witty, but it's really not. Encouraging kids to ask questions automatically gets them out of their own mind and gets them interested in the other person's mind. So if you could start anywhere, eye contact is going to be huge whenever it's possible. Summarizing, saying, repeat after me, or tell me what you heard me say. And then encouraging people when they're talking to one another to open the conversation up with open-ended questions, asking them about other people so they get in those worlds rather than just talking about their world.
Thank you.
Those would be 3. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I think we're going to wrap it up. How's that? You're pretty quick
Sounds
on your
good.
feet, man.
Yeah?
Hey, let's give Joe a round of
happening.
applause here. Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much, you guys. Appreciate your time.
And Joe, I was wondering if we could get your phone number just to put you on speed dial.
Just,
you know,
you can call City
we
Care's
can
front
call-
desk, 402-916-9421. You
Okay.
can call them anytime. I have normal working hours. I don't answer my phone after that. So there you go.
Oh, great. I was
Yeah.
expecting that you'd just pick it up anytime we had a question.
You think so? Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I guess, would that be overtime hours I charge
Yeah,
for?
there you go.
That
There
type
you
of
go.
thing. But yeah, City Care's in 6 different locations around Omaha. We have 2 locations in Nebraska as well, Lincoln and Kearney. If you're ever looking to talk to a therapist like myself, we have over 50 therapists around those 8 locations who are phenomenal at their jobs. As a matter of fact, we have a brand new therapist working here at the Journey Church location, and he just got his license, Mr. Jeff Wynn over there.
Yeah,
Congratulations,
there you
sir. So he'll be officing right here
Yeah.
inside the church, along with, I believe, Jessica Bailey, who's been here for, what is it, almost a year now? Or how long has she been here?
I'm not sure. I haven't even been here that long, so.
Several months. So and she's doing a great job, too.
Yeah.
So if you guys are ever looking for any type of help, City Care's been here for 10 years, and we're not going anywhere.
Cool. Thank you so much, Joe. Appreciate you sharing with us. And there's a lot of content tonight, and honestly, the questions, thanks for coming and giving your time tonight and engaging with your questions. I enjoyed that, just hearing some of the questions and the responses, too. That was really good. I was thinking, if we could take one thing, Jim, that we learned tonight and begin to put it into practice, how transforming that would be. I was thinking, I've got a 28-year-old son that lives with me. They say that when your kids get older, they move out, but I find they also move back. And I found, I'm really good at giving my opinion. But one of the things that was shared tonight is asking permission. I think I should practice that one a little bit more. That'd be good. I want to let you know, we're going to have more of these kinds of talks. Our next talk is coming up March 27th at 6:30 p.m., and Katie, right over here, is going to be talking on this subject, why your relationships are giving you anxiety and what to do about it. And let me throw it just in a real quick scenario so you may dial it in. Have you ever had a conversation where you walk away and you begin to be a little bit anxious about it? Because suddenly your mind starts to go, did I do more damage than good? Did I say something I shouldn't have said? Did I say too much? And you see how that snowballs into all this anxiety-producing kind of stuff going on. Anybody been there? Okay, good. Well, not good, but Katie is going to be addressing that. And, she's here tonight, so if you have any more questions on that, do talk with her. But thanks for giving your time this evening. I would like to just close out with a word of prayer and ask that God would give us help, okay? Let's pray. Father, thank you so much. Thank you for Joe as he shared tonight, and just thank you for how you have gifted him, not only in ministry, but the ministry of counseling. And Lord, just thank you for his insights and wisdom he shared tonight. Lord, I pray as we head back into our relational settings, I ask, Lord, that you would remind us of some of these things that really stirred in our own hearts tonight as we listened. Help us to put some things into practice and ask you for help. Ask you for help. And Lord, I pray that you would bring change and that we would be delighted to see you work and that we'd give you praise for that. So thank you for this evening. We pray your blessings on each one. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for coming.